This is Moscow City, which for nearly 2 decades now has represented the heart of business in Moscow and Russia. It is where numerous companies have their headquarters or regional offices, and where foreigners are constantly buzzing about among the regular office plankton, while tourists gawk mouth agape, necks craned back to the point of snapping, staring to the tippity tops of those steel and glass edifices erected in the name of industry. It is also where most of the foreigners I personally knew, those who lived in Russia for many, many years prior to the start of the war, it's where they worked. Since the spring of 2022, however, most non-Russian businesses have closed up shop in one form or another, or accelerated the process of replacing foreign specialists with homegrown ones, making the prospects of nabbing a cushy position in one of those towers or in another business park around the city or country at large, making that much less likely. So, for the handful of people entertaining the idea of relocating to Russia, let's explore how you can legally work here. Long story short, you probably can't. With the exception of a few former Soviet republics, most people who want to legally work in Russia have to have either residency or a work visa, specifically residency. That is typically the way to go. So let's talk a little bit about how one can get residency, because there are currently 2 established ways of doing it. Established, keyword there. There is residency by quota and residency without quota. Let's start with residency by quota. It's basically the same as if you were in the United States and a foreigner wanted to get a green card. You have to get together a bunch of documents, submit those to the migration services, and then hope that you get chosen by the selection committee. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of documentation, I do want to make it clear that you do have to do pretty much all of the following steps from within Russia. I would figure that would be kind of obvious, but just wanted to make sure that was clear. Pretty much everything that I'm talking about you are going to have to do within the country. Also, there are a number of factors which can help you get temporary residency. Those things would be having a university degree, having no criminal record, having a specialty in a profession which is in high demand here. Owning real estate is always a plus, residential real estate. Having a legal source of income that you can prove here, and then also if you have relatives who are citizens of the Russian Federation and who are currently residing in the Russian Federation. However, all of those huge pluses, they don't guarantee that you would get temporary residency by quota. So let's talk a little bit about the documentation that you will need to submit. I mentioned lack of criminal record is a big plus. You do need to submit a criminal background. That is probably the most complicated of the entire procedure. What you're going to have to do for that is, if you're in Russia, and this is what we're going off of, if you're in Russia, you're going to go to the one location in the country, as far as I know, it's in Moscow, and you're going to have to get fingerprinted there. Again, I'm talking as an American, so other countries are going to have slightly different ways of doing this. You go get fingerprinted, then you have to send those fingerprints off to the FBI. Theoretically, you would mail them to an address in the States, and then from that address, you have to pay by check, and then you have to have another form inside there. So all that then gets mailed off to the FBI. They then will run the background check, and when the background check is finished, they will then put a stamp on that document. Now, that stamp on the document is kind of a big deal, because 90 days from that stamp on the document, that's when all of your documents have to be submitted. So, basically the way it works is, in those 90 days, you're going to get that document back, and you're going to have to then get it translated and apostolized if you're in your home country. I don't remember, and I don't actually maybe know off the top of my head here, if you can get it translated and notarized here in Russia. You can do that with some documents. With the background check, it might have to be done in your home country. If this is something you're into, look into it or talk to a migration consultant. Anyway, I did it through the U.S. Department of State, so I sent the background check off, or I had it sent off to the U.S. Department of State with another check and another document saying what I needed from them, translated to Russia, and the apostolization. And then when that was all finished, I had to, it was sent back to my mailing address in the States, and then from there it was forwarded to me via FedEx or DHL. The big problem these days is the fact that the international document couriers like FedEx, DHL, UPS, they don't really work in Russia anymore. And if somebody out there knows of a company that is doing the international mailing, stuff like that, right below in the comments, I would like to know, and I'm sure there are other people out here who would be interested in that information. But by and large, it is still possible, but from what I've heard, it's more expensive and it takes longer. So yeah, that 90 days, it seems like a long time, but all things considered, it does get eaten up relatively quickly. Now, that said, in those 90 days, you're going to be doing other things. You are going to be getting a medical. You're going to go through a medical commission. It's pretty straightforward. You just have to go to a number of different doctors, and they have to take a look at you and put a stamp on some pieces of paper. You have to, for the temporary residency, get a tuberculosis test, which requires going to another location typically. If you're lucky, you can get it done in a single day. Otherwise, it might take 2 or 3 days depending on appointments. But that said, it is relatively painless. I would say probably the most difficult part of all of it is just finding where you can actually get the committee done, because you can't just go to any clinic in the city. You have to go to specific ones that are approved by the government. Okay, so there's those two. Those are two of the big ones. And then beyond that, we have the exam. Now, the exam is really, all things considered, not that difficult. It is a test of civics, basic legislation, history of Russia, and language. A lot of people get worried about the language. However, the entire exam is in Russian, so if you don't know any Russian, you're not going to be able to do the exam anyway. With the Russian aspect, what do they expect of you? Well, they are expecting an elementary level. On the European language framework, A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, I would say you're looking at an A1, maybe slightly A2 level. Very basic stuff. When it comes to writing, you have to write a little note that is to a potential employer, for example, of you being interested in a job, or maybe a note that you left to your friend about having to meet them somewhere. The reading is very straightforward. Again, it's little placards of information or little notes, and then you have to answer some questions about them. And with the speaking, it's basically you would speak about something as though you are in a shop, or maybe in a brief interview type situation. So yeah, realistically, the exam is very, very simple. It is the most basic level of Russian that you need to get by if you're planning to live and work in Russia. So the fact that you have to pass an exam for that is really not a big deal. Beyond that, you are also going to need to have a document which shows you have enough finances to support yourself for a year. And then there is the actual application that you have to fill out. I'll talk a little bit about the application a little bit later, but that's long and short. You get all of those documents together. It is possible I forgot about a document or two. It has been a number of years now since I did this myself. But regardless, you get all of these documents together, and then you go to the migration office of whatever locale you're in. I would assume most people are interested in Moscow. That would mean going out to the city of Sakharova, which is an hour and a half by car from the center of Moscow. It's technically another city, but it's also technically part of Moscow. It's stupid and complicated, and no Muscovite actually likes Novaya Moskva, but that's an entirely different subject. And then, you submit the documents. Now, when you submit the documents, assuming that there are no problems with those documents, everything should be ready in about 4 months. That is the longest period of time, although that might be without quota. When you're applying by quota, it may be only a month that you have to wait before you get your response. Regardless, what I will say is that the government organ, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the government organ that is responsible for doing things like that connected to migration, they don't update their website very regularly. So speaking from personal experience here, when I was told I had to wait 4 months for temporary and then permanent residency, I ended up waiting longer because they didn't update the website to show that my documents were ready. With the permanent residency, I ended up waiting 6 months, all things considered. Now, if you're applying by the quota system, it is possible you may get turned down, and the reason for that is just simply numbers. In 2024, the total number of available temporary residencies by Quota was 10,000, or is, I suppose, 10,595. That's for the entire country. And I should also note that that is down 20% from 2023. And it's not beyond the realm of possibility that that number will decrease further. So competition for a temporary residency by quotas is very high. Currently, Moscow has 1,500 temporary residency permits that they are allotted, with another 750 going out to the Moscow Oblast. St. Petersburg has 300, with another 125, I believe, going off to Leningradskaya Oblast. And then there are a few other areas that have like a couple hundred. Stavropolsky Krai, I think some places down south. Obviously, some of the other cities like Novosibirsk and Yekaterinburg, some of the cities of a million, they're going to have maybe 200 to a lot as well. But competition is very fierce. So yeah, there's not a lot of actual evidence, a lot of statistics connected to acceptance rates, but we can probably guess with that small number that they're not very high. However, the one piece of information I was able to find was from a few years back, 2022, when the quota for St. Petersburg was 600, double what it is today. And the number of people who were granted temporary residency in July of that year was all of 13, maybe 16, I can't remember, 13 or 16. Very, very few. So you can imagine the hundreds, if not thousands of people in St. Petersburg who were applying for temporary residency. And in the month of July, only like 13 or 16 of them actually got it. So it's really not easy to get temporary residency by quota. That said, there is no wait time. If you are rejected, you can turn around and the next month put in for temporary residency again. In fact, I have a friend who has a business, and at their business they have some people from Uzbekistan working from them. Uzbeks they're one of those former Soviet countries that has kind of a special work relationship here with Russia. But still, they want temporary residency because it does afford them some comforts that they don't have just being here otherwise. Anyway, my friend, these Uzbeks have worked for them for years at this point in time, and they have time and time again applied for temporary residency and been rejected. So it's just like this kind of ongoing process, and they have not gotten it yet. So obviously, if you're coming from the West and you're coming here on a visa, then getting rejected, you're not going to be able to just turn around and do it again because your visa might expire, or your fingerprints, the 90 days is going to run out. So it's obviously one of those things that if you're coming in to try to do this by quota on like a tourist visa, then you really only have one shot. I will say that I think I am about to be forced out onto the street here. Okay, we'll do that, I guess. Gotta love Sobyanin's construction. It never ends, does it? I'm gonna cross the street here. About to cross. Okay. And let's not get killed by a scooter. Where was I? So I was saying that as a Westerner, I would probably recommend that you use a consulting agency, a migration consulting agency, simply because, as I mentioned before, when you have to fill out the paperwork, there are a lot of little nuances, and unless you have a very strong level of Russian and you are comfortable with spending hours in like Kontakte forums and reading all of the little details connected to migration, or you have a Russian friend who is going to be very patient and is going to help you with the whole process, just pay a couple extra $100, use a migration firm. They will make sure that you don't make any tiny stupid little mistakes on your paperwork, because you go to the migration services and they can just straight up reject your paperwork, even if it's like a comma in the wrong place or something like that. They can be very, very anal about all of that stuff. So that's what I would recommend. Personally, when we submitted my temporary residency, and then my permanent residency, all the documentation for that. We did that all of ourselves, but I guess we're just special. I would recommend that most people fork out the dough and just sleep easily at night. Also, those specialists can submit some of the documents for you, so you don't actually have to travel that hour and a half, for example, out to Sakharova, which is kind of a pain in the ass. Beyond that, though, what I will say is if there is any interest in hearing a little bit more about my personal experience with the whole temporary residency and then permanent residency, that whole process, just let me know and I can do a little more in-depth video on that. I have to not get killed by falling. Shit. Все? А чё там? Ок, ага, все. Спасибо. Yes. If it's not the facades attempting to kill you, it's the fucking scooters. Okay, now I'm in a slightly safer area, I hope. And we'll talk about the second way that you can get residency, which is without quota. This is very simple. It's basically by marriage. In fact, it's really only by marriage for most people. And all of the stuff that I described for the temporary residency by quota is applied to the without quota as well. The only difference being that with it being by marriage, for example, you then have to submit your marriage certificate with it. If you are married in Russia, you just submit a copy. If you get married outside of Russia, you then have to obviously get the marriage certificate translated and notarized as well and submitted. But everything else in terms of paperwork and documentation is exactly the same. So those are the two, what I would call, established methods for getting temporary residency. Now, the reason I said two established methods is because like 48 hours ago from filming this, Vladimir Putin signed a just ridiculous, in my opinion, kind of harebrained presidential decree, which is so vaguely worded. I will be doing a follow-up video on the presidential decree in another month or so. But the way it works right now is how it says is that for citizens or residents of countries with neoliberal agendas, which is again, an undefined Kremlin dog whistle, which we're basically just going to assume means, I guess, like non-friendly countries in their point of view, that citizens and residents of those neoliberal agenda countries will be able to apply for temporary residency without quota, and that they will not have to take the exam for civics, history, and Russian language. So, ignoring the fact that the whole process for how this is going to work is unclear, that's why I said he signed the decree, and it basically said that the Russian government has a month to figure out what he meant by that. So, a really good management in that sense. Moving along, though, even when the government finally lays out what their criteria are for people applying for this, I would say, from my experience with changes to visa and migration rules here in this country, it's going to be at least another 6 months after that before we actually understand how this is all going to work out. So currently there are still just the by quota and without quota, although in the coming months it will become more clear that there is a without quota that is going to be, well, we don't know the criteria for it. What I personally found interesting with regards to the whole news with the presidential decree is that there was really no reaction here in the Russian public, but the expat community has been creaming themselves nonstop for the last, well, since it was announced. They have just been like, it has been kind of disgusting to witness. Now, I'm going to say, personally, I don't think this is like really anything great in a lot of ways. I said I wasn't impressed with this presidential decree, and what I mean by that is because it's effectively a 3-year work visa without employment. Now, by and large, the only way to get a job here in Russia is to have a basic minimum level of Russian language skills. What would be expected of you for the required temporary residency permit, that exam, even that realistically is not enough to get a job here. So what we're going to have is people who are coming into Russia and effectively knowing none of the language, but at the same time they're going to be expected to find a job and learn the language simultaneously. Now, is it possible that somebody comes into Russia without a knowledge of the language, and in 3 years they're able to learn the language? Oh, I should clarify too that the reason I say 3 years is how long they have to learn the language is because temporary residencies are only valid for 3 years, at which point in time you either have to leave the country, and you're not coming back in on another temporary residency. You either have to leave the country, or you have to apply for permanent residency. And the presidential decree makes there's no way of getting around the exam that's required for the permanent residency. And the exam for permanent residency is slightly more difficult. I would say like A2 to A1 level, if I were to pin it somewhere, maybe slightly more difficult. It's still really not all that intensive, all things considered. But if you're coming from 0 and you're going up to B2, yeah, you could do that in 3 years. It is possible. My whole question here, though, is for all of these people who are getting really excited about it, where have all of these people been all this time? If you're motivated to learn the language and you're motivated to move to a new country and get a job in that country where you're going to have to use the language, where have these people been for the last, well, we'll say 3, 4, 5 years? Where have they been? Why haven't they been here already? Now, I posed this question online, and the answer I got was simply that it's only been in the last few years that people have really understood how Russia has become a bastion of traditional values. And you know what? I accept that argument because, you can be forgiven if, 3, 4, 5 years ago you didn't realize that Russia was a bastion of traditional values, because living here, and from what I saw and legislation, things like that, Russia itself 3, 4, 5 plus years ago didn't realize it was a bastion of traditional values. If you go back and you look at discussions in society and things in legislation and just generally speaking how things were in Russia, really even 3 years ago, I feel like this discovery of it being a bastion of traditional values, Russia kind of discovered that in the spring of 2022. That's that's when all this legislation went down. So it might be some coincidences there. But anyway, yeah, if you're in the West and you're watching this and you're just like, well, I never knew it was a bastion and this was the traditional values country, that's okay. You can be forgiven because Russia itself is also learning that as well right now. So you guys are all, I guess, figuring this out at the same time. So the reason I actually decided to make this video was not because of the presidential decree. It was because a week or so ago, on all of the Russian state television channels and on a few Telegram channels as well, there was this story of an American family who had received refugee status in Russia to escape woke culture in the US, which I'm not even sure how legally they can apply for refugee status in that regard, but regardless, the reason I decided to probably do this because of that is because, sure, with refugee status, you jump to the front of the line effectively, and you are going to have a situation where you'll be able to get your residency not automatically, but much faster. You'll be able to stay in Russia and work here even before you have that because you're a refugee. However, I would highly recommend that you just don't do that. Don't do that. Don't be a shithead. Don't apply for refugee status to Russia unless you're, I guess, an actual refugee. The reason for that being that when you apply for refugee status, what happens is, remember I mentioned the Ministry of Internal Affairs, MVD. So when you apply for refugee status, MVD takes your passport, and that's it. It's theirs then at that point in time. And the way it works is you will then have that refugee document, and you'll be able to apply for temporary residency, and then after you have temporary residency, you'll be able to apply for permanent residency. But right there, you're looking at a 6-year period of time, pretty much minimum, because once you have permanent residency, it's at least 5 years before you can apply for citizenship. And what I mean by that 6-year minimum is that's how long you're minimum going to be in Russia without being able to leave Russia. They are talking about extending that 5 years to 8 years before you can get citizenship too. So realistically, it's a minimum of 6 years before you can get Russian citizenship, although theoretically that might be bumped up to, what would that be, 9 years. Then, let's say you wanted to go back and visit family in the States or in Europe or wherever you came from, you would then have to apply for a visa, and I can imagine that that would be a logistical nightmare. So, long story short, if you think you're going to somehow game the system and cut to the front of the line by going for refugee status, just don't do that. Refugee status exists for actual refugees. Again, don't be a shithead. That's kind of the big thing. Okay, and then that brings us to the final option, the non-residency option, which would be a work visa. Now, as I alluded to at the beginning here, work visas for foreigners are just not that easy to get to anymore. This has been a trend that started a long time ago, when, even like back in 2014, basically the only people who can get work visas anymore are highly qualified specialists, and most of those people would be in the spheres of oil and gas, mining, typically resource extraction. Now, obviously, there can be some exceptions made for IT specialists, but by and large, the Russian IT industry is kind of self-sufficient in that regard these days. There's no need for them to invite foreign specialists in to take care of that, especially with a lot of the sanctions and whatnot. What I will say, too, is that the reason that they're not super keen on the idea of work visas is because it's additional bureaucracy and additional expenses for any company that decides to take it on. So it has to be somebody that they really, really need. What I mean by that is, so it's more expensive because the minimum salary for anyone on a work visa is 167,000 rubles per month, which is already quite a bit more than the average Russian salary. And then on top of that, for the first 6 months that that employee is in the country, they have to pay 30% tax for that employee and not 13%. So that is also, the first 6 months, kind of expensive. The other thing I said, though, is bureaucracy. Each company then has to submit paperwork every quarter, which basically shows that they're paying them the required amount. And yeah, just a lot of headaches. They also have to apply for a work permit because not anyone can just get it. It's one of those things that you have to apply to the government for as a business to show them that you actually need this person. The one exception to this would be in the quote-unquote international schools for English teachers. However, unless you have a background in education or you have some experience working in international schools, like maybe you've spent a few years working in China or Dubai or someplace like that, it's not like you can just waltz in off the street and get a job there. That's not how that works. So, and even for people who do have an education background, the number of positions for work visas in those schools is limited, right? It's not elastic. There are set limitations just on the number of schools and the number of teachers within those schools. So work visa, even though it is something that you in theory can get, it is not super easy. It's about as easy, I suppose, as residency, which in and of itself is not easy to get. So there you have it, a kind of brief run through of why, as a foreigner, it's not really all that easy to legally work here in Russia. Residency is not an easy thing to get, again, unless you are married, and then the paperwork is still a nightmare. And work visas are very hard to come by these days. So, yeah. I don't want to dissuade anybody from potentially moving to Russia if that's where your heart truly is, but I would, by and large, recommend a more gradual approach to it. What I would suggest is you come over on a tourist visa, just to visit as a tourist. Then, if you think that you want to move here, save up enough cash and come live here for a few months in the summertime or in the springtime. Choose a period of time of the year and see what it's like here. If you have the finances to do it, come back at 2 different periods of the year, because being in Moscow in the summer is one thing. Being in Moscow, or Petersburg, Jesus Christ for that matter, in the winter, that's an entirely different beast. And a lot of people just aren't ready for it. Not that there's nothing to love. I love winter here. I love summer here. I hate November. November can piss right off. February, close second, if I had to get rid of one. But beside the point. Get to know the country a little bit before you just jump in head first. It would be better for you in the long run so that you don't go in with any illusions, and it would be better for the country too so that a bunch of uninformed doofuses don't show up on their doorstep one day, because nobody likes that. Nobody likes that at all. I probably will, but if people are interested in it, I would plan to make a video in the future where I focus on that sort of slow moving process and a little bit more in depth as well. It would be a little bit shorter than this one. There's not that much to say with regards to it, but if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about how to move here and that whole process as well, and from my experience what I would suggest to you, let me know in the comments, and I will definitely get to work on that. Probably going to do a video too in the near future about some other stuff I alluded to in this video, like the expat community. Not a huge fan of them. We'll talk about that and why. But yeah, I felt that with the news of the family getting refugee status and then this wonky presidential decree from a few days ago, I felt like this was probably a video that I needed to make because as far as I'm concerned, those are still the three avenues that you have to working in Russia legally and in a reasonable way. If you have any questions, leave them below. But yeah, this has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.